Most people think weakness looks obvious. They imagine trembling hands, broken confidence, fear in someone's eyes, but real human weakness is rarely visible. Sometimes it wears a perfect smile. Sometimes it hides behind ambition. Sometimes it sounds intelligent, disciplined, even powerful. And the most dangerous part is this: people usually don't recognize their deepest weakness until life uses it against them. A man can spend years believing he is strong, only to collapse the moment he is ignored, rejected, disrespected, left alone with his own thoughts, because weakness is not the absence of strength. It is dependence. Dependence on validation, dependence on control, dependence on attention, dependence on being needed. Dependence on emotional certainty in a world that promises none, and human beings, despite all our technology, intelligence, and modern sophistication, are still deeply fragile creatures searching for emotional survival. That is the uncomfortable truth. Most people are not living consciously. They are reacting, compensating, escaping, trying to outrun insecurities they barely understand. Carl Jung once suggested that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And that is exactly what happens to millions of people. They think they are making choices, but often their wounds are choosing for them. The man obsessed with success may not love achievement. He may simply fear feeling invisible. The woman who cannot leave toxic relationships may not mistake pain for love. She may mistake familiarity for safety. The person who constantly tries to dominate conversations may not be confident at all. They may be terrified of insignificance. Human weakness often disguises itself as personality, and society rewards the disguise. A child learns very early which emotions are acceptable, which emotions are dangerous, which vulnerabilities lead to rejection, so people begin building identities around survival. The quiet boy becomes emotionally numb. The anxious girl becomes a perfectionist. The rejected teenager becomes obsessed with status. The lonely man becomes addicted to control, not because these identities are authentic, but because they protect something wounded underneath. And eventually, the mask becomes so normal, people forget they are wearing one. You can see it everywhere, in the man checking his phone every 30 seconds hoping someone texted him first, in the person who cannot sit in silence without opening another app, in relationships where people say, "I love you," but secretly mean, "Please don't abandon me," in the constant need to appear happy online while privately falling apart. Modern life has created endless ways to distract people from themselves. Noise has become anesthesia. Silence has become terrifying because silence forces confrontation, and most people are not afraid of failure nearly as much as they are afraid of self-awareness. That is why loneliness feels unbearable for so many. Not because being alone is painful, but because being alone removes distraction. Suddenly there is no audience, no validation, no stimulation, only the self. And many people discovered they do not know who they are without external approval. This is where human weakness becomes dangerous, because a person disconnected from themselves becomes vulnerable to almost anything: manipulation, addiction, ideology, toxic relationships, false purpose. When people are emotionally starving, they will consume anything that temporarily numbs the hunger. That is why emotionally empty people often chase intensity instead of meaning. They confuse excitement with fulfillment, attention with love, desire with connection, but intensity cannot heal emptiness. It only distracts from it, and eventually the distraction fades. It always fades. You see this in modern relationships constantly. Two people meet. Attraction feels overwhelming. The chemistry feels almost cinematic. They project fantasies onto each other. They imagine salvation, completion, escape. But eventually reality appears. The insecurities return. The fears surface. The masks slip. And suddenly the relationship becomes a battlefield between two unhealed nervous systems trying not to feel abandoned. One withdraws emotionally. The other chases harder. One becomes cold. The other becomes desperate. Neither understands they are not fighting each other. They are fighting their own unresolved weakness. That is why emotionally mature people are so rare. Most adults simply become older versions of emotionally reactive children. Same fears, same ego, same need for validation, just hidden beneath better language and adult responsibilities. A man in a suit can still be emotionally controlled by rejection. A beautiful woman can still feel worthless without attention. A wealthy person can still feel empty every night. External success often hides internal instability. In fact, sometimes success strengthens weakness instead of healing it. Because power can become emotional armor, money can become avoidance, status can become compensation, relationships can become dependency. Nietzsche warned that people often avoid truth not because truth is difficult, but because truth destroys illusions they emotionally depend on. And human beings love illusions. We love believing we are rational, strong, independent, but observe people carefully during emotional pressure. That is where truth appears. Watch what happens when someone is criticized, ignored, embarrassed, rejected. The ego reveals itself immediately. Some become defensive, some become aggressive, some collapse internally while pretending not to care. Very few remain calm, because emotional control is rare. Most people are controlled by emotional reflexes they never examined. A single comment ruins their day. A stranger's opinion alters their self-worth. A breakup destroys their identity. Failure makes them question their value as a human being. Why? Because their foundation was external. And anything external can be taken away. This is one of the deepest psychological tragedies of modern life. People build identities on unstable things: appearance, popularity, success, relationships, social approval. Then they wonder why anxiety follows them everywhere, because deep down, they know it can disappear, and the mind becomes terrified when identity depends on temporary things. That fear changes behavior. People begin performing instead of living. They say what gains approval. They suppress unpopular thoughts. They become addicted to fitting in. Even individuality becomes performance now. People curate personalities like brands. But behind many carefully constructed identities, there is exhaustion, because pretending is psychologically expensive. The human nervous system was never designed to maintain constant performance. Sooner or later, the mask cracks. And sometimes life forces it to crack violently. A betrayal, a divorce, a public humiliation, a financial collapse, a lonely night where the distractions stop working. Suddenly the person meets themselves without filters. And for many, that moment feels unbearable, because beneath the confidence there was fear. Beneath the arrogance there was insecurity. Beneath the control there was helplessness. This is why some people become cruel when they feel weak. Cruelty often comes from emotional powerlessness. People who cannot regulate inner chaos frequently try to control external reality instead. They dominate others to escape feeling small. They manipulate to avoid vulnerability. They humiliate others to temporarily elevate themselves. But the relief never lasts, because unresolved weakness cannot be conquered externally. It follows you into relationships, into success, into solitude, into old age. Schopenhauer believed much of human suffering comes from endless desire, and modern society weaponizes that desire constantly. You're told you are incomplete, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not admired enough. So people spend their entire lives chasing psychological completion through external achievement. But desire is endless. Once one goal is reached, another appears. That is why many people secretly feel empty after achieving what they once desperately wanted: the promotion, the relationship, the fame, the body, the money. For a moment, there is emotional relief. Then silence returns. Because the real problem was never external. It was internal fragmentation, a disconnected relationship with the self. And this is where human weakness becomes deeply existential. Most people are not merely afraid of pain. They are afraid life may have no permanent certainty at all, that relationships can end, that youth disappears, that death is unavoidable, that meaning is not automatically given. Existential fear sits quietly beneath modern life like a shadow most people avoid looking at directly, so they stay busy. Constant stimulation, constant goals, constant noise. Not because movement creates peace, but because stillness creates confrontation. But eventually, every human being faces moments where distraction fails. A hospital room, a breakup text at 2 a.m., a funeral, a betrayal by someone trusted completely, a lonely drive home after realizing success did not heal loneliness. And in those moments, people meet the truth of themselves. Some break completely, others awaken, because suffering has a strange psychological property. It destroys illusions. Pain reveals attachment. Fear reveals dependency. Loss reveals identity. You truly discover yourself when life removes what you thought you needed. That is why some people become wiser after suffering, while others become bitter. One person uses pain for awareness. Another uses pain for resentment. One asks, "What is this teaching me?" The other asks, "Who can I blame?" And that difference changes everything. Stoic philosophy understood something modern culture often forgets. A person who cannot govern themselves will always be emotionally vulnerable to the world, not because emotions are weakness, but because unconscious emotions create weakness. There is a difference. Suppressing emotion is not strength. Performing toughness is not strength. Pretending not to care is not strength. Real strength is awareness. Awareness of your impulses, your fears, your insecurities, your shadow. Jung believed that people who refuse to confront their darkness often become possessed by it unconsciously. And you can see this everywhere in human behavior. People condemn in others what they secretly fear in themselves. The man obsessed with proving masculinity may secretly fear inadequacy. The person constantly judging weakness may secretly hate their own vulnerability. The emotionally unavailable partner may not lack feelings. They may fear emotional exposure. Human beings are walking contradictions. We crave intimacy, but fear vulnerability. We want freedom, but fear uncertainty. We seek truth, but avoid discomfort. And this tension creates enormous psychological exhaustion, especially in modern society where people are constantly observed. Every opinion becomes public. Every insecurity can be compared instantly online. Every flaw feels visible. So people become hyper-aware of perception, how they look, how they sound, how they are judged. But there is a hidden psychological cost to constantly managing perception. You lose contact with authenticity, and eventually, you become a stranger to yourself. That may be one of the deepest forms of weakness, not physical weakness, not financial weakness, identity weakness, a fractured self, a person who no longer knows which parts of their personality are genuine and which parts were created for survival. This is why some people feel strangely empty after social interaction. They were performing the entire time, and performance creates loneliness because people can admire the mask while never truly knowing the person behind it. That is why some successful individuals feel profoundly isolated. They receive attention, but not understanding. Validation, but not connection. The soul does not heal from applause. It heals from truth. But truth requires vulnerability. And vulnerability terrifies the ego, because the ego survives through control. It wants certainty, superiority, protection. Yet life guarantees none of those things. And this creates permanent tension inside the human condition. The stronger the illusion of control, the more devastating reality feels when control disappears. A man spends years building an identity around competence. Then he loses his job. A woman builds her worth around beauty. Then age begins changing her reflection. Someone builds their emotional stability around a relationship. Then betrayal arrives unexpectedly. Suddenly identity collapses. Not because life became cruel, but because identity was attached to unstable foundations. This is why psychologically resilient people are different. They do not depend entirely on external conditions for self-worth. They understand loss is inevitable, rejection is inevitable, misunderstanding is inevitable, and strangely, accepting this makes them calmer because acceptance reduces panic. Most suffering comes not only from pain itself, but from resistance to reality. People suffer twice, first from life, then from refusing to accept life. Existential philosophy often explored this uncomfortable truth. Human beings want permanence in an impermanent world, but everything changes. Relationships, bodies, status, emotions, circumstances. Even identity evolves constantly. The problem is not change itself. The problem is attachment. People cling psychologically to versions of life that no longer exist. Old relationships, old dreams, old identities, and weakness appears when the mind cannot release what reality already has. That is why some people remain emotionally trapped for years, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack surrender. They replay conversations endlessly, imagine alternate outcomes, obsess over what should have happened. Meanwhile, life continues moving. There is something haunting about watching people emotionally imprison themselves inside memory, especially when the world outside remains full of possibility, but pain creates familiarity. And familiarity can become addictive. Even suffering can become identity. Some people no longer know who they are without struggle, so unconsciously, they recreate chaos repeatedly, not because they enjoy pain, but because pain feels psychologically familiar. This explains why some individuals repeatedly enter destructive relationships, why some sabotage success, why some push away people who genuinely care about them. The nervous system often prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar peace, and that realization changes how you see human behavior completely. You stop asking, "Why would someone do this to themselves?" and start asking, "What emotional reality are they unconsciously trying to recreate?" Most people are not driven purely by logic. They are driven by emotional conditioning, childhood experiences, humiliation, abandonment, validation, fear. These invisible forces shape adult behavior far more than people realize. The adult who fears abandonment may become controlling. The adult who never felt seen may crave attention obsessively. The adult punished for emotion may struggle to express love. And often, they do not fully understand why they behave this way. That is the tragedy of unconscious weakness. It controls people silently. A person can spend decades believing the problem is the world, while never recognizing the unresolved conflict inside themselves. But awareness changes everything. Pain that is understood transforms differently than pain that remains unconscious. Once you see the pattern, you are no longer completely trapped inside it. That does not mean healing becomes easy. It simply becomes possible. And real healing is far less glamorous than people imagine. It is not becoming emotionless. It is not becoming superior. It is not achieving perfect confidence. It is becoming honest. Honest about fear. Honest about ego. Honest about loneliness. Honest about dependency. Most people would rather protect their image than confront their truth. But growth begins exactly where self-deception ends, and self-deception is one of humanity's favorite survival mechanisms. People lie to themselves constantly. "I don't care. I'm over it. I'm fine. I hate them. I never needed anyone." Sometimes those statements are true. Often they are emotional armor, because vulnerability feels dangerous in a world where people have experienced betrayal, humiliation, and disappointment repeatedly. So they harden. But emotional numbness is not peace. It is protection. And protection can slowly become prison. The person who never trusts again may avoid betrayal, but they also avoid intimacy. The person who never expresses emotion may avoid embarrassment, but they also avoid connection. Every psychological defense has a cost, and eventually people must decide, is safety worth isolation? That question quietly shapes countless lives. Some choose safety forever. Others risk vulnerability despite uncertainty. Not because vulnerability guarantees happiness, but because emotional avoidance guarantees disconnection. There is a quiet sadness in realizing how many people spend their lives hiding from each other emotionally, wanting connection, wanting understanding, wanting love, yet terrified of exposure. So they communicate through masks, through roles, through performances, and then wonder why loneliness persists. But occasionally, someone breaks the pattern. Someone becomes deeply self-aware, deeply honest, not performative honesty, not dramatic vulnerability, real honesty, the kind that says, "Yes, I am insecure sometimes. Yes, rejection hurts me. Yes, I have weaknesses. Yes, I crave connection. Yes, I fear loss. Paradoxically, that honesty creates strength because what is acknowledged no longer needs constant defense. And this may be one of the deepest psychological truths of all. The people who appear strongest are not always those who feel no fear. Often, they are the ones who stopped running from themselves. They integrated their shadow instead of pretending it did not exist. They accepted human imperfection instead of performing superiority. And because of that, they became harder to manipulate emotionally. Not cold, not detached, grounded. There is a difference. Grounded people do not panic every time life changes. They do not collapse every time they are rejected. They do not need constant external reassurance to feel valuable because their identity is not entirely outsourced to the world. That kind of stability is rare now, and rare things become powerful. Especially in an age addicted to emotional reaction, today people are rewarded for outrage, for impulsiveness, for performance, for spectacle. Calmness almost feels rebellious. Silence feels suspicious. Self-control feels unnatural, but emotionally reactive people are easily controlled. A person who cannot regulate anger can be manipulated through provocation. A person desperate for validation can be manipulated through attention. A person terrified of loneliness can be manipulated through attachment. Weakness always creates vulnerability somewhere. That is why self-awareness matters, not to become superior to others, but to become less controlled by unconscious patterns. The goal is not perfection. Perfection is another illusion the ego uses to avoid self-acceptance. The goal is consciousness, to see yourself clearly, your motives, your fears, your contradictions, your emotional dependencies, and, perhaps most importantly, to stop expecting yourself to be something other than human, because many forms of suffering come from impossible internal expectations. People think strength means never breaking, never doubting, never hurting, but every human being hurts, every human being fears, every human being struggles internally. Even the people who appear composed externally often carry silent psychological battles nobody sees. The man sitting quietly at work, the woman smiling in photographs, the confident friend giving advice to everyone else. You never fully know what people are carrying privately. That realization should create humility, because beneath status, appearance, ideology, and identity, human beings are remarkably fragile creatures trying to survive emotionally in a chaotic world. And perhaps weakness itself is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is. Weakness acknowledged can become wisdom. Weakness denied becomes destruction. One creates empathy. The other creates projection. One creates maturity. The other creates suffering. At some point in life, every person faces a choice: continue running from themselves, or finally sit in silence long enough to understand who they really are beneath the performance. That moment is terrifying, but it is also where transformation begins. Not the dramatic transformation sold online, not instant confidence, not emotional invincibility, something quieter, more real. A person slowly becoming less divided internally, less dependent on applause, less terrified of rejection, less controlled by impulse, less enslaved by ego, more honest, more aware, more grounded. And perhaps that is the closest thing human beings ever come to freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from unconsciousness, because life will still wound you. People will still disappoint you. Loss will still arrive. Time will still erase many things you love. But awareness changes the relationship you have with suffering. You stop seeing pain as proof of worthlessness. You stop seeing rejection as proof of inadequacy. You stop seeing loneliness as proof you are unlovable. Instead, you begin seeing these experiences as part of the human condition itself. And strangely, that realization softens something inside you. Not weakness, resistance. In the end, the psychology of human weakness is not really about failure. It is about avoidance. Avoidance of truth, avoidance of vulnerability, avoidance of self-awareness. And the people who finally stop avoiding themselves become psychologically dangerous in the healthiest possible way, because they are no longer easily controlled by fear, not fearless, just conscious. And conscious people move through life differently. They speak differently, love differently, suffer differently. They no longer need to pretend they are invincible. Because they understand something, most people spend their entire lives trying to escape. To be human is to be fragile, but to be aware of that fragility without allowing it to rule you. That is where real strength begins.